1. I'm an 18-year-old female living in a small town in Michigan. When this incident took place, I had been working a few hours a week in a small pizzeria. I was in my town, and I had been working there for about a year when my boss decided to go on vacation. She and her family lived in an apartment below the restaurant, and 2 other apartments were overhead. In order to get into these apartments, you had to go to the back of the building and down a sketchy set of stairs or the grass slope, where you would find her door and the stairs leading up to the apartments above. Beyond that, there is a yard and then some woods. I think it's important to mention that there was absolutely no reason to be behind the restaurant, unless you were trying to enter the apartments. Now, I usually worked with my mom because we got stuff done easily and I hate answering phones. One night my mom was feeling ill, so I had to work with another lady. She was very sweet but not super efficient, so I was working hard to keep up and getting a bit agitated when she told me that we needed Parmesan. I agreed to go get it from the store just down the road, if she promised not to make me answer phones for the rest of the shift. There was only about 2 hours left, which were normally pretty slow, so I guess it didn't matter that much anyway. As I was getting in my SUV, I saw a guy pull into the small parking lot with a beat-up car and park near the back. He was lanky and wearing oil-stained shop clothes, which was and still is totally normal around here. He got out and retrieved the bag from his trunk and headed down the slope. I know this guy wasn't a renter because I'd never seen him before, and the renters frequently ordered pizza. It was possible that he was a friend of one of the renters, but that didn't seem right. It was 9:30 at night, and one renter was a single mom and the others were 2 brothers with mental health issues that were pretty antisocial. I was getting bad vibes, so I grabbed my knife from the center console and tucked it up my sleeve. Call me paranoid, but there'd been a lot of car fires and break-ins around that time, so I was nervous to go anywhere unarmed. It might have been a stupid thing to do, but I considered my boss a friend, and didn't want this guy to hurt any of the renters or steal from any of the apartments. I decided to go see what he was doing just in case he had any ill intentions. I got out of my car and walked quietly down the slope. There was motion-activated lights, so I could easily see what he was doing. He was fiddling with an old keyring and trying to get into my boss's apartment. "What are you doing?" I asked loudly so that my coworker could hopefully hear me through the open back door. He was startled but smiled and told me he worked for my boss's husband, and he was there to feed the dog and let it out. His smile was creepy, the kind that a liar gives when they're trying really hard to convince you. My boss did have a dog, and her husband did own a fabrication shop, so his story seemed to check out, but I was still not convinced. I decided to go get the cheese and check in again when I got back. "Okay, let me know if you need help with anything." I tried to sound as normal as possible, but I was seriously creeped out. I hustled at the store and back to work. I'd been gone only about 15 minutes when I got back, and surprisingly he'd already gone. I was still feeling suspicious, and bad for the dog who'd been shut in a good portion of the day, so I decided to text my boss when I got out of work. Fast forward 2 hours, and I was on my way home. I got to my door when I decided to check Facebook. As I was scrolling, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was a picture of my boss with her dog on the beach from earlier that day. I called my boss and then the police to make a report. It turned out the guy had been fired by my boss's husband earlier that week for making an inappropriate comment about his 19-year-old daughter and repeatedly harassing other female staff. This guy had planned some sort of revenge scheme, but didn't know they had left for vacation. His bag was full of tools and a couple knives. During questioning, he told them that the only reason he left was because he thought I was watching him. Thankfully, he went to jail for that, and a couple of other things that he'd been wanted for previously. This still creeps me out to this day, and I hate to think what would have happened if they had been home. 2. In 2011, I was an art and design student in London. London was a daunting place at this time with increasing crime issues, and coming from a small rural fishing village up north, I was unfamiliar with the lay of the land as well as the multifaceted cultural scene in this city. Nevertheless, there was a great allure to the Big Smoke. Over the course of the next few months, I picked up work in a busy bar in East London. As a small, petite and shy girl, I found the job very challenging, and found social interaction amongst the regular punters both daunting and intimidating. I still remember my very first shift of taking the rubbish out onto the ice-cold streets, to be met with the harsh smell of sick and the stern voice of an elder gentleman proclaiming, "London is no longer safe." This was my first interaction with a man who I will refer to as H. And while I initially grew inquisitive as to this man's nature, I soon receded into the solitary nature with which I was accustomed, when faced with the stark realization of what this man was. As a regular at the pub, he was familiar with all the regular servers. And as the pub was a small affair, the cozy nature often drew in the same crowd. As an outsider entering the big city for the first time, with an increasing distaste for my opted degree, I am sad to admit I began neglecting my studies, and with the extortionate cost of London living, it was necessary for me to pick up more hours at the pub. I grew to trust H, and equally he began to confide in me. There was something about this man that I was intrigued by. There was a lot more below the surface, and I wanted to find out what that was. Over the course of the next couple weeks, he confided in me about his family life, which seemed fairly normal, and I am not one to judge quickly, but there were subtle clues that this man drowned a deprived sorrow in his mind. However, one day H stopped coming into the bar. This was not picked up on by anyone else, as similar to me, H appeared to be an outsider, which was part of the reason we bonded so much. Nevertheless, the loss of his presence did surprise me, and I was once again alone in the bustling metropolis. A couple of weeks passed, and I had just started to accept the fact that H was never going to be seen again, which I attributed to the potential cross-country relocation to be closer to the family he told me he was up north to. That was until I found the doll posted through the letterbox of my rented accommodation. The doll was dirty, with matted hair, and looked dated. My first inclination was that a delivery had been posted to the wrong address, yet no envelope or stamp was present. I will clarify at this point that I confided in no one about this strange occurrence, which I would in hindsight attribute both to my fear of crowds and underthinking the potential ramifications of this incident. I continued to work for a couple weeks more at the bar, though as the winter receded, another strange occurrence materialized. I was tapped on the back by the bar manager and asked to follow her through to the office beside the kitchen in the bar, which we often used for eating lunch or taking a brief break between busy times. I shrank into myself when I saw that a dress was pinned to the wall in the room, with a note pinned on it with my name. The dress had the same dated appearance as the child's doll, and was similarly dirty. My heart skipped a beat as I linked the two incidents, and immediately confided in my manager about the previous occurrence. I, however, did not immediately link the two incidents to the disappearance of my workplace local H. That much I can attribute to my manager, who I am thankful for to this day, as she later attested to the fact that many years prior to my entering into the job at the bar, H had lost his granddaughter, for which he was the primary carer, in a terrible childhood accident. He had spoken about it at length to the bar manager over the years, and apparently I had a strikingly similar appearance, particularly due to my petite nature. Needless to say, I left the job with immediate effect and moved back home. I never did see H again, so H, let's not meet again. 3. Before I start, I should probably mention that I live in Mexico, in an old neighborhood where it is really quiet and almost deserted at night. There were no families living around me back then, only elderly people or adults who worked all day, and whom I rarely caught a glimpse of. At the time, my mother had gotten a shitty job on the other side of the city and usually left by 5 p.m., returning home until past 2 a.m. My father was rarely at the house when I came home from work, which was typically at 8 or 9 p.m., depending on my shift. I am also an only child, so yeah. There was no one to keep me company at night except for my dogs. That day had been particularly exhausting. I had taken too long finishing up my duties, and had ended up leaving work at around 9:30. I got off at 9 that day. I wasn't too worried about how late it had gotten until my dad had promised to pick me up. Unfortunately, when I came outside he wasn't there. He was never late, so I got angry instantly, knowing he'd probably forgotten to pick me up. Sometimes he didn't have a phone. I knew I only had two options. waiting another 20 minutes for him or walking home. I ended up deciding to walk home. I always put my earphones on when walking home, which is something my parents really disapproved of, saying I should be aware of my surroundings, but the streets were unusually crowded. I didn't think much of it and felt safer. Now, my neighborhood is divided from another one by a two-way street that stretches from the beginning to the end of it. I was on the left side of the road, and next to me there were cars going south. The cars typically race through this street, so it's hard to cross to the other side, and I typically crossed once I was further up the street. Anyway, like I mentioned, my neighborhood isn't the best, and the entrance is very empty at times, except for the cars driving by. I always lowered the volume on my iPod when I started making my way into the neighborhood, just to be careful, and this day wasn't the exception. I was almost entering my neighborhood when I noticed there was this white pickup truck driving really slowly on the other side of the road. At first I didn't think much of it, but then I realized something was wrong, because cars don't typically drive that slow around here. I tried not to think much of it and just kept walking up the street until I heard someone shouting. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I did notice it was a man, and that he was waving at me across the street over to his side. Now, I'd never had anyone follow me before, so my reaction wasn't to be suspicious, but rather curious. I thought it might be someone I knew since I wasn't wearing my glasses, and I can't see well from far away. I didn't stop walking, but I did slow down a bit. I squinted my eyes, but I couldn't see his face very well. That's when things got weird for me. The car wasn't familiar, and from what I could make out, I didn't know him. I started ignoring him, walking faster up the street whilst he continued to motion for me across the street and shouting. Once he saw I was ignoring him, he started driving a bit faster, chasing after me. By then I started panicking, clutching my keys and doing the Wolverine thingy with them, like my friend once told me to do when walking home. It might sound like I'm overreacting, but there had been a couple of robberies of late. Mind you, I was like 3 blocks away from my house now, and this guy was still chasing after me. Only then I noticed that the fucking streetlights leading up to the street were flickering on and off, and that the street is completely dark up ahead. My hands were shaking, not wanting to lead this guy to my house, but not knowing what to do either. Now, I don't know how to explain this, but there's this small park strip kind of area right on the edge of a block. The landscaping is uneven, and there are massive trees and rocks in it. I stupidly decide to run into it and hide behind one of the large rocks at mid-level. I was a tiny thing back then, only 5 feet tall and 100 pounds, so this was my best bet. I certainly couldn't fight the guy, nor could I outrun him because, smoker. My lungs were already killing me from the running I'd done. I stayed there crouched behind the rock, trying not to make any noise, and then I heard him shouting, "I'm gonna get you one of these days, you dumb bitch." I felt fucking sick as I tried to listen for any footsteps. Then I heard the noise of someone shutting their car door, and him saying something with a laugh. I could only make out my workplace's name from what he said, and that was enough to freak me out. I don't know how I did it, but eventually I ran home and locked myself inside. I tried to calm myself down and decided a hot shower might help. I don't know why my stupid teenage ass didn't think to call the police or my parents to report this. After an hour or so, I have calmed down a bit, and I go out into the backyard for a cigarette, thinking about the man and wondering what the hell that was about. I was mentally chastising myself for thinking hiding behind a rock was going to work, and even more conflicted because it had actually worked. I don't know why the guy didn't chase me into the park strip, because he could have easily gotten me. Anyway, I'm in the backyard, hiding in case my father came home because I wasn't supposed to smoke, when I hear my dog Ollie whining and barking. He usually does this when a family member comes over, so I assume it's just my father, and I put out my cigarette. I'm running to the front door. My house is tiny as hell, and you know the doors that have tiny windows at the top? Well, for some reason I decided to check through it before I opened the door, and there I see the same fucking man from earlier trying to pet my dog Ollie through the metal fence. Ollie wasn't having that shit though, staying away from him. But he also isn't menacing enough, he's a golden retriever, to scare the guy away. My other dog Max, who's a Belgian Shepherd, joins him in the bark fest, and then the guy finally backs off, looking scared and annoyed as hell. I'm on the verge of tears though, scared that this guy will try and hurt one of my babies, or jump over the fence, but also fearing for my own life. The barking apparently alerted one of the neighbors, and thank God it was my fucking cholo neighbor from across the street. He looks pissed as hell, glaring at the guy with a scowl. This made the guy get in his car and leave. I hate to say it, but I didn't do anything until he left, frozen in fear. I should probably mention that again. I didn't manage to see the guy's face or his car plates. I only saw he was wearing a black jacket, and that wasn't any help. I eventually decided to call my uncle in the hopes he was with my father, and he was. My father got home about 15 minutes later, and I told him what had happened. I of course got scolded for not calling the police, and my father agreed to pick me up from work for like a week after that. I'd like to say this is where the story ends. Stranger, let's not meet again. And all that jazz, but no. Eventually I started walking home by myself again. I didn't see the pickup truck at work or at home ever again, but after that day, I started getting incessant phone calls to both my cell phone and house phone. Always when I was alone at home, so neither of my parents ever got these calls. Weird Facebook friend requests from obviously newly created Facebook accounts, text messages, etc. Most of them saying things like, "You're a stuck-up bitch. You don't have to act this way. Your little boyfriends need to watch themselves. I'm way better than them, you'll see." And others were rants detailing the sexual things he wanted to do to me. I don't know why. Up until that point I wasn't frightened. I was more disgusted and annoyed. One day I thought I might have seen his pickup truck one afternoon outside of my high school, but he wasn't in it. I figured it was a coincidence, and my boyfriend at the time walked me to the bus stop, despite me warning him about the messages. I later confirmed it was him, though, because I received a message that afternoon saying, "You look hot in your school uniform, and you're a little slut, aren't you?" After that, I became very aware of my surroundings, and hardly ever ventured outside my house alone, not even to smoke. I started getting scared of walking home alone and shit, but I had to anyways because my parents didn't have the energy to give a shit about me. A couple weeks later, I went to work and found Raul, a co-worker who typically worked during the morning shift, waiting for me with our boss. Long story short, our boss told me he thought my stalker was the same guy who had harassed Elizabeth, a female co-worker who had quit a month before I started working there. Our boss pointed out that Elizabeth and I looked very similar. Short, fair skin, dark hair, and to top it all off, we dressed the same. We were pretty gothy. But the most disturbing thing is that they had an idea of who the guy might be. There was this guy named David who came in every day and ordered the same thing. Raul didn't like him and said he'd always flirt with Elizabeth before he started with me. David would always flirt with me, but at the same time he'd say weird things like, "So is your nose the only thing you got pierced?" He'd hint towards very sexual things and then cut it out when he noticed I got uncomfortable. I remember that about a week prior to the white pickup truck incident, Raul and I had been working the same shift for a week, and David had come in. David greeted me as usual, and I was placing his order. Raul interrupted and said he'd do it. I was confused, but since I didn't feel like talking to David, I didn't question it, and went to the back to clean. Raul then told me that David had given him a piece of paper with his number on it for me. Raul refused to accept it, and told David it was inappropriate. He said David had laughed and asked if I was his girlfriend, but Raul said he told him that was none of his business. That made me think of the messages I'd gotten and the whole thing about my boyfriends. David never came back to my workplace after this incident. Our boss eventually suggested giving me shorter shifts so I could go home before dark as a temporary solution. I agreed and eventually quit altogether after 3 months because the harassment just didn't stop, and my mom started taking it seriously. I deleted my old Facebook account and created a new one with a fake name until I felt safe again. I also changed my phone number, and my parents changed the house phone number. It was a pain in the ass, but it worked. I never got contacted again. It's been years and I still don't know if it was David like Raul said. I like to think it was him, but it still makes me wonder how the hell he got my phone numbers and my full name. Whoever it was, I hope I never encounter them in any way. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 356. Okay, this is Monday, so that means, it's Christmas Eve, if you're into that sort of thing. Just so everybody knows, there will be a new video up on Christmas Day. Schedule will proceed as normal, that's the plan. No special videos, I don't really have the time to do them at the moment. We'll see if we can do some. Let's not plan ahead. I was going to say, let's see if we can do something for next year, but we'll see. And just have happy holidays or happy Tuesday, whatever you prefer. And I will see you next time. Okay, so with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.